Um,
Oh,
so for those who are here, am I good? Um, for those of you that are new here, this is your first time joining us at BIOMES. This is our weekly seminar series. And like most things at YSE and across all of Yale, BIOMES is an acronym that stands for Bridging Issues and Optimizing Methods in Environmental Studies. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor James Kirchner, Professor Emeritus at ETH Zurich, Senior Scientist at the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, and Landscape Research, and the King Carl the 15th Gustav Professor of Environmental Sciences at SLU in Umeå, Sweden. Professor Kirchner's work sits at the intersection of hydrology, geomorphology, and environmental geochemistry, where he uses, I think as we'll see today, a combination of field data, lab experiments, and mathematical modeling to investigate how landscapes function. His research has helped reshape not just how we understand the movement of water through ecosystems, but better shaping our ideas of runoff and flow and how these processes regulate erosion, weathering, and the chemistry of rivers and soils. He has previously served as the director of the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, and Landscape Research, was a longtime faculty member at UC Berkeley, and is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union. Today, he'll be sharing a talk titled Instructive Surprises in the Hydrological Functioning of Landscapes, where he'll walk us through some unexpected challenge, some of our conventional assumptions about how water moves through and shapes the environment. So please help me in welcoming Professor Jim Kirchner.
So first of all, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here. Particular thanks to the BIOMES organizing committee for inviting me to come to Yale. I have not been on this campus literally in decades, but a little known secret is I nearly came here for my PhD. I was going to work with Herb Borman on acid rain at Hubbard Brook. And instead, I wound up going to Berkeley and working with other people on acid rain in the Rocky Mountains. It is very interesting to be back and very interesting to see how the campus has been transformed, not only physically, but also in terms of the kinds of things that people are working on here. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank a long list of collaborators who have been involved in the work that I'm going to be talking about today, and to apologize in advance if I've left anybody out. My central thesis today is that we can learn really interesting things about how landscapes work by studying their streams and studying the solutes that they carry. So catchments are fundamental units of the landscape. At any point along a stream, you can define the catchment as the land area that drains to that point. And so if we study the flow and the chemistry of what comes out in the stream, we can potentially learn a lot about what's going on inside those units of the landscape. Or to borrow a phrase from my friend and colleague Kevin Bishop in Sweden, streams are mirrors of the landscape that reflect the physical integration of processes in their surrounding catchments. Now, hydrology isn't just a purely academic exercise. We need to understand how water moves in the environment in order to assess flood risks and to develop strategies to mitigate them. Here are some example floods in recent years from various parts of Switzerland, for example. Than we need. In flooding, often what kills people and breaks things is not the water. It's the stuff carried by the water. So here we see a video from the Illgraben catchment in Switzerland, which gets several flows like this every year. The big boulders there have diameters between 1 and 2 meters. The dam that they are pouring over is 5 meters high. This flow probably has a total of 30,000 cubic meters of material, and you don't want to be in the way, okay? So in steep mountain regions, I mean, speaking as someone from Switzerland, the major hazards of flooding often come not from water, but from rocks and trees and other things that are carried by those flows, including massive blocks like the one shown in the middle photo with the little yellow backpack for scale. And these kinds of risks make it particularly important to understand what controls peak flows in steep mountain streams like these. And of course, sometimes the problem isn't too much water, but instead not enough. And again, some examples from Switzerland and from the rest of Europe in the summer of 2022. So drought is a problem not only for water supply and not only for farmers, it's also a problem for forests because it makes trees more vulnerable to attack by pathogens and insects. And it, of course, increases the risk of wildfire. And it does so dramatically that I think we really should be thinking of wildfire as a hydrological phenomenon above all else. So understanding how water behaves in the environment is really important, but it isn't easy. And even someone as bright as Galileo threw up his hands and said, I can't figure this out. Now, some of us might say, oh, come on, Galileo, it can't really be that hard. I mean, it rains and the ground gets wet and the rivers fill up and we have floods. And if it doesn't rain, well, the soils dry out and we have a drought. And what's so hard about that, Mr. Galileo? And of course, we can understand such a very general view of these things, but making that view more precise and quantitative isn't easy. Having said that, there are some people in my field who try to make this subject as complicated as they possibly can. I'm not one of those people. And so in today's talk, I'm going to try to describe some ways that we can understand how water moves in the environment without too much unnecessary complexity. So I've taken the title from a review that appeared in 2023, an annual review of Earth and Planetary Science, with two dear friends of mine, Ilya von Meervelt from the University of Zurich and Paolo Benettini from the University of Lausanne. And in this paper, we outlined things that we have learned as a community in the last few decades that now may seem pretty obvious, but that were surprising from the perspective of the conventional wisdom at the time. I won't go through all of these today, but I will mention a few of them. So right from the bottom of the list here, in the textbooks, the landscape feeds water to the stream. But the reality, particularly in the modern world, is often exactly the opposite, as this paper in 2021 in Nature showed. So the red areas in the graph on the left are places where 60% or more of groundwater wells have water tables below the nearest stream. So the stream is feeding the surrounding landscape rather than the landscape feeding the stream. Now, unsurprisingly, as you can see on the right, this is more common in places that are arid, and it's more common in places where the topography is really flat. So you don't have gravity driving water toward the stream. And it's more common in places where people are pumping groundwater. And so if you superimpose the red regions from the three graphs on the right, you get pretty much what you see as the red regions on the left. Now, a lot of us know that groundwater levels are declining in many places around the world. A recent study published in Nature last year showed not only are we losing groundwater, but those groundwater losses are accelerating in many parts of the world, particularly in dry lands that are under active cultivation. That is, the intersection of climatic aridity and water demand for agriculture, perhaps unsurprisingly, creates groundwater losses that are accelerating over time. But groundwater levels are not falling everywhere. There's some interesting counterexamples, such as under some major cities in the desert Southwest. In some of these cases, we have very depleted aquifers that are rebounding because pumping controls have been implemented, which shows, yes, you stop pumping groundwater and the system tends to recover over some timescale. In other cases, these are what are called managed aquifer recharge, where you inject water into the ground, or you let water pond on the surface and infiltrate. In other cases, however, this is what's called unmanaged aquifer recharge, due to leakage or due to irrigation seepage or due to wastewater seepage and things like that. Now, I'll mention that this study was based on compiling literally millions of groundwater level measurements from around the world in an effort that took the first author of this paper 5 years. There are 1,400 references to that in that paper. And the supplementary information is almost 1,000 pages long. The first author there, Scott Jascheko, University of California at Santa Barbara, he is a very thorough guy. Now, you might think that a tree gets its water from the rain that fell last week. And we were interested in trying to understand whether that's the case. And to do this, we can take samples of the xylem water in the tree and analyze those for their isotopic composition. And we can compare that to the seasonal cycle of water isotopes in precipitation, which tend to be heavier in the summer and lighter in the winter in temperate continental interiors like Switzerland, for example. And so we sampled nearly 1,000 trees across Switzerland, and we did it in a really fun way because the landowners won't let you climb their trees because they want to sell the wood, and they don't want the scars from tree climbing spikes. You take a technician, you put him in a harness, you connect a cable to a helicopter, and the helicopter flies him around to individual trees that have been GPS coordinated because you want to be able to revisit those same trees over and over again. He clips branches off those trees. Those get, processed and packaged and so on and taken back to the lab. I totally want that job. They won't let me do it. Anyway, so when you do this, you get this as a result. So we have here a bunch of different sites ranging from dry sites, Swiss-style dry sites, which means less than a meter of rain a year, to wet sites, which means about 2 meters of rain a year. And the bluish band, the light bluish band, is the isotopic composition of rainfall in the winter at that site. The yellow band is the isotopic composition of the rainfall in summer at that site. The sampling was done in August, okay? And what you can see is all the trees, until you get to pretty high altitudes where things are pretty wet, all the trees look like they're getting their water from winter precipitation, even in August. And it rains more in the summer than it does in the winter in Switzerland. So what's going on, right? This is trying to tell us something. I mean, one thing it's trying to tell us is, yeah, you get more rain in the summer, but you probably don't get more infiltration. Probably most of it evaporates. And probably a surprising amount of it evaporates in forest ecosystems. Either that or what does infiltrate may be moving through the rooting zone to deeper groundwater under summer conditions due to what's called preferential flow. Now, there's another sort of lesson here, which is that people who analyze tree rings often assume that what you get from a tree ring and the isotopes in a tree ring, for example, is a representation of the growing season or the annual average or something like this. And people are trying to read climate signals out of isotopes in tree rings. But if the water the trees are using actually came in the winter, then you are not measuring the summer growing season signal. Okay. Now, in a textbook, a stream network is a fixed feature of the landscape. And my graduate student at the time, Sarah Godsey, shown in the picture, wanted to test this idea by mapping the flowing stream network under a range of different flow conditions at Sage Hen Creek in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. Now, under wet conditions, Sage Hen Creek is a fourth order network with 35 kilometers of channels. But under dry conditions, the same basin is only a second order network with 15 kilometers of channels. So is Sage Hen Creek a fourth order basin, or is it a second order basin? Also at low flows, you can notice that a lot of the flowing network is actually disconnected from the outlet. So that means that the aquatic habitat in that system has not only become smaller, it's become fragmented. I'll also mention that the field work involved in this could get to be really pretty epic. You know, to map a 35-kilometer stream network, you need to walk up and down every fingertip of that network. That means you walk twice the network length. So that's 70 kilometers. Right? And the Sagehens Creek Basin has one road and no trails. And Sarah Godsey is only about this tall. But you absolutely do not want to get in a fight with her. This is one very tough lady. She did this 4 times, and she did it in 4 other basins, many of which are a lot rougher than Sagehens Creek. So this phenomenon of network extension and contraction and connection and disconnection has huge implications for aquatic organisms. Also, as my colleague Ilya von Meervelt showed a few years ago in a really elegant paper, this extension and retraction of the stream network changes the connectivity between the network and the surrounding landscape. And so it changes how quickly precipitation reaches the stream from that surrounding landscape. Now, 10 years ago, Sarah Godsey and I showed that as landscapes get wet and then dry out, there's a power law relationship between the flow rate in the stream and the total length of the stream network, and thus what we call the drainage density, the number of kilometers of channel in a square kilometer of drainage basin. Now that means that if we want to understand the variability in stream network length, we need to understand 2 different things. One, how variable is stream flow? And second, so that's Q in that equation. The second thing we need to understand is how sensitive the length of the network is to variations in stream flow. And that's that exponent beta. And so what determines this sensitivity exponent, beta? So the key here is to recognize that the points where streams begin to flow are where there is a balance between 2 different things. First, the flow that's draining off the landscape, right? Which depends on the drainage area and depends on how fast we're adding water to that landscape. It depends how wet the landscape is. The second factor is the capacity of the subsurface in the valley to transmit that flow without the water table rising to the surface and making the channel wet. So that will be determined by the width and the thickness and the permeability and the slope of that valley bottom. So if we want to understand how much networks extend and retract, we need to understand the balance between those 2 factors and how they vary across the landscape. So about 5 years ago, Jeff Prancevic and I showed that we can distinguish highly dynamic stream networks from really static ones based on 3 parameters we can infer from topography. The first is, as we go downstream, how fast do we accumulate drainage area and therefore accumulate water that we need to somehow accommodate in the system. The second is how fast the channel slope decreases as we go downstream. And therefore gravity isn't helping us so much to carry that water through the valley axis. And then the third factor is how fast the valley width and permeability change as you go downstream. So the end result of this was a paper that appeared in Science this spring that modeled stream network dynamics for 15,000 basins around the United States. And this analysis showed that the total length of stream networks in the United States changes by about a factor of 5 between annual high flows and annual low flows. So an implication of that is that of the total stream length in the United States, about 80% of it goes dry at some time during the year. So the networks that you see in the maps and in the textbooks are some snapshot at some time of what the real network is. And it could be significantly longer or significantly shorter, depending on when you go out into the field. And anyone who goes out and gets their feet wet in the field would understand that this happens. But the academics who sit in the office it's taken them a while to catch up on this. We're making progress though. So perhaps the most consequential surprise in recent decades for hydrologists can be illustrated by considering the standard model of storm runoff generation, which was taught for decades and is still probably taught some places today. So in the standard model, the storm flow peak of the hydrograph was assumed to be recent rainfall that reached the stream fast by overland flow or flow through macropores in the subsurface. And that storm flow is assumed to be superimposed on a slowly varying base flow of old water from previous storms, which came to the stream slowly by groundwater flow paths. And you can see where this view of the world might come from. I mean, after all, runoff does respond very quickly to rainfall, and it seems logical then that these peaks should be recent rainfall. It seems intuitively obvious. And that does happen in some disturbed landscapes in particular, and urban catchments in particular. You know, downtown New Haven, absolutely. You know, your runoff peaks are recent rainfall that fell in the streets and went into the storm sewers and so on. But in most humid, temperate landscapes, we now know that that standard model is simply not right. And the reason we know it's right is because if the storm peaks were mostly new water, chemical and isotopic tracers in those storm flow peaks should look like the rainfall, and they generally don't. So instead, what we typically see is that, okay, not a very good laser. Well, maybe you see the laser dot, maybe you don't. So here we have, for example, deuterium in precipitation and in stream flow, precipitation in light color, stream flow in dark color. And you can see that day to day, the precipitation varies tremendously, and the stream flow is basically a flat line. We see the same thing if we look at chloride ion, which is a relatively passive tracer as well. So the only way that stream flow can have a roughly constant tracer composition as the precipitation composition is bouncing up and down is if stream flow is created from a mixture of many previous rainfall events worth of water. So what that tells you is the landscape is storing and mixing precipitation over timescales that are very long with respect to the timescales of individual rainfall events. Okay, great, but this just creates a new puzzle. And the new puzzle is physically, how does this work, right? How does a piece of landscape store water for weeks or months, but then mobilize that same water in a matter of hours or even minutes as soon as the rain falls? And there have been various mechanisms that have been proposed theoretically that might explain this, but there's still a lot of work to be done. This remains an open question that I'm highlighting here, mostly to illustrate how chemical and isotopic tracers have really been driving our field forward and confronting us with the fact that some of our simple stories don't work. Now, I'd like to explore this a little further in the foothills of the Swiss Alps. And here we are at one of our field sites with a visiting group of students from Tsinghua University. And you might recognize Minhui Li among this group. And I've just dragged everybody up that mountain on the left of this picture. You come to Switzerland, I'll drag you up there too. I won't drag you up the side of the mountain you can see. Little hint, it's a lot easier on the other side. There's actually a trail. You know, you would survive the experience, and the view from the top is fantastic. If you stand at the top and you look to the left on this diagram, you see the main range of the Alps right in front of you. If instead you stand on the top and you turn to the right, you see this. You see the drainage basin of the Alp River. And today we're going to be looking at data from the mesoscale Alp catchment, which is about 46 square kilometers, and from two small research catchments called Lumpenenbach and Erlenbach, and from three tiny microcatchments, each of which is only about 1,500 square meters in size, which is roughly the footprint of this building. And we're only going to be looking at data from snow-free periods when the landscape looks about like it does in this picture. And we're here because mountain streams can go from the condition shown on the left to the condition shown on the right in less than an hour. And we want to understand how that works. We want to characterize this runoff response and explore how it's shaped by precipitation intensity and by the conditions that prevail on the landscape when the rain falls. Okay. Now, what I'm going to present in the next few slides is based on what I call runoff response distributions. And I want to illustrate what I mean using synthetic output from a simple model. So on the top, you see a graph of stream flow over time. And the colored bands show the addition to stream flow from the individual colored rainfall events. And we get that by running this simulation with and without those individual rainfall events. So those colored bands tell us how different stream flow is when you have this rain versus when you don't have this rain. The middle panel shows the runoff response to all 10 of those labeled inputs plotted against a baseline of 0 so we can compare them. And the bottom panel shows all those same curves, but synchronized to the time the individual rainfall events occurred. The dark blue curve shows the ensemble average of those different response curves. So what we want to do is we want to estimate what that response curve is in the real world, not in simulation results. And the question is, how can we do that? The challenge, as you can see here, is that the effects of individual storms are overprinted on each other, right? And so they need to be unscrambled from each other. In mathematical terms, they need to be what's called deconvolved from each other. So the challenge is to deconvolve the streamflow time series by the precipitation time series. The tricky part of this, there is established mathematics for doing this that's decades or centuries old. The tricky part is that if the underlying system is nonlinear or non-stationary, the conventional methods don't work. Figuring out how to do it was my pandemic project. I was lucky enough to have a lot of time to myself, and it took a couple of years to do it. But it turns out there are ways you can move forward on this problem. It's important to emphasize that we're not talking about a model here. We're talking about a model-independent approach for finding systematic patterns in data, okay? As an example, we're in contrast to a conventional kind of deconvolution, which would assume that everything is linear. It would assume that if we have 2 units of input, we get twice as much as having 1 unit of input. So instead, what we do is we allow the response to be some nonlinear function of the input intensity. And that nonlinear function is something that we allow the data to tell us by a linear approximation to whatever that curve happens to be, which means that we can still solve the problem efficiently. Similarly, conventional approaches assume that the system is stationary. That is, the response of the system is the same regardless of when the input comes, right? And we can instead break the time series up and separate the effects of different inputs under different conditions, even though their effects are eventually overprinted on each other through time. Okay, I'll spare you all the details because, yeah, we won't have time for that today, and you don't want to know about all. Well, if you want to know about the details, there's a great paper in Hydrology and Earth System Sciences. It's only 36 pages long. There are only 63 equations in it, I think. Yeah, well, it's all based on another paper where all the really ugly math is. Anyway, you're welcome to take a look. But let's apply this now to this set of research catchments in the Swiss Alps. So here are the response curves for the little tiny catchments and the mesoscale catchment for different wetness states of the landscape, as reflected in what the stream flow was before the rain fell. Okay, and those are the different colored curves. And what do we see? We see that, unsurprisingly, as you go from very small to very big, right, the runoff response is damped and somewhat delayed. But we also see that at all of those scales, it's very sensitive to how wet the landscape is, okay? And we want to understand that. We also see that the response is really quick. So if we're going to understand this, we want to be able to, again, use chemical and isotopic tracers, but we need to be able to use them on the same time scale as that hydrologic response. So to do that, we set up field laboratories with isotope analyzers, ion chromatographs, and other instrumentation right by the streams in the field. It would be impractical to sample at that kind of high frequency, bring the samples back to the lab, and then analyze them. So because we couldn't bring the samples to the lab, we had to bring the lab to the samples. And I owe a huge debt to Tracy Napitapulu and Bjorn Studer, the technicians who made all this magic work. It takes a significant investment in technical expertise to be able to pull this off. It also takes a non-trivial amount of money, but we won't get into that. The Swiss, fortunately, have money. So anyway, if you do this, you can get an exquisite view of the dynamics of the system, including hour-by-hour variations in the isotopes within individual storm events, where precipitation can vary by vast ranges inside a single storm event, shown in blue here, and you can see the response in the stream, which is significantly damped, right? So this can allow us to infer how much of the response in the stream is due to recent rainfall versus rainfall that's stored in the landscape. So here is an example of what we can learn from this. The three different curves show the runoff response of the stream when the initial conditions are relatively dry versus relatively wet. And you can see, unsurprisingly, when it's relatively wet, we get a much bigger response. The dotted lines there show how much of that response is due to the release of stored water from the landscape. All right? So what you see is that as we go from dry conditions to wet conditions, we get a much bigger response that is primarily driven by the water that's already in the landscape. That means that as you make the landscape wetter, the major difference is that it's easier for that landscape to release the water that's already stored there, not that it makes it harder for water to infiltrate, and so water just dances over the surface into the stream, right? Which took our dominant hypothesis and threw it back in our faces, right? The great thing about having a hypothesis is it gives you Mother Nature an opportunity to just slap you and tell you you don't know what you're talking about. And that's how you learn things, okay? Now, as I said, this process of deconvolving streamflow time series by precipitation time series can be both nonlinear and non-stationary. And so we can, for example, use this to explore how the runoff response depends on precipitation intensity or on how wet the landscape is. So here are families of curves that we get for the peak runoff response at a particular place that's been very well studied in Wales. And as you can see in the graph on the left, you can see that the peak response is sensitive to antecedent wetness, and it's more and more sensitive and more non-linearly sensitive as your precipitation intensity goes up. As you can see from the graph on the right, this peak runoff response is very sensitive to precipitation intensity, and it's more and more sensitive and more non-linearly sensitive as you go from dry conditions to wet conditions. Okay, so there's an interesting sort of three-dimensional relationship there between precipitation intensity, how wet the landscape is, and how much the stream responds to your rainfall. And we'd like to be able to map that out. And the question is, can we summarize this in some simple way with a couple of index numbers that we can then evaluate in different places around the world? So, you know, the simplest, dumbest thing you could think of to do with this is to say, okay, we've got relationships, and we know that as we go to absolute dry, so the stream isn't flowing, we're probably going to get zero response. And as precipitation intensity goes down to zero, we're probably going to get zero response. So we need some function that goes to zero when any of its inputs go to zero and is nonlinear. What's the simplest thing that does that? Power functions do that, right? So we can write that the peak flow is, some function of the antecedent discharge, how wet the landscape is, and precipitation intensity raised to some exponents, right? And the cool thing about that is that your null hypothesis then becomes a statement about those exponents. If the system is stationary, then that alpha parameter is simply zero, right? And the first term becomes a constant. If the system is linear, then that beta parameter becomes one, and everything becomes a linear function of precipitation intensity. Okay, so that would be cool if it works. Well, let's get some data. So here's some data. And that equation fitted to those data points, fits tolerably well. And importantly, we can constrain those two scaling exponents tolerably well. Okay, so let's go back to the Swiss Alps and let's look around. So here is the runoff response as we go from very small to mesoscale, reasonably big. And you can see that those curves don't look so much like each other, but those scaling exponents are pretty similar, where they're all between something like 0.3 and something like 0.5. Similarly, if we ask about the nonlinear sensitivity to precipitation intensity, we see that they go, again, for these different systems between, something like 1.5 and something like 1.65 or something like that, right? So these are reasonably well constrained, even though if I showed you the individual time series, you would say, yeah, they don't really look so similar to me. Okay, so how does that compare to the rest of the world? Well, fortunately, in recent years, we've had the emergence of national scale and regional scale data sets of precipitation and stream flow, usually at daily frequency, sometimes at hourly frequency, that allow us to begin to explore these sorts of patterns. So here we have about 500 basins around the US for which we have hourly precipitation and stream flow data. And the redder points are more nonlinear, and the bluer points are less nonlinear. And what you can see is that very few of these systems look like they're linear. And we're getting numbers of about 1.3 to 1.5, not so different from what we saw in Switzerland. And the non-stationarity exponents, are something like 0.3 or 0.5, again, not so different from what we saw in Switzerland. Here are 400 basins around the UK, some pretty big ones up to 10,000 square kilometers. And again, you can see none of them look like they're very stationary and none of them look like they're very linear. And there's some range of behavior here, right, that we can quantify. We still don't understand very much about why some of them are more nonlinear than others. You can get weak correlations with various landscape attributes, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done, not only to understand why do we get this number here and that number there, but to understand physically what's going on, physically what accounts for that difference. What is this trying to tell us about mechanisms? There's still a lot of work to do. Of course, coming from Switzerland, I have to show you data from Switzerland. Here are about 100 basins from Switzerland. And again, they look kind of the same as everywhere else. You might ask, wait a minute, why don't I see any streams from the Alps in the southern part of Switzerland? And the answer is every single one of them is affected by hydropower. There are no stream gauges in the Alps that are not completely messed up by diversions and hydropower. They've done a lot of plumbing in the Alps. Now, how much does this matter? Well, I mean, just from the standpoint of trying to say we want to predict stream flow and we want to predict peak stream flows, because that's what kills people and breaks things, right? So here, just as an example, if we make a nonlinear and non-stationary sort of fit of those kinds of equations to stream flow in this particular basin, then we get the blue curve on the top graph, where the gray curve is the measured values. If we do the best we can to make a linear and stationary fit to those same data, we get the blue curve on the bottom graph, okay? Where you can see we kind of miss all of the interesting stuff that happens in the peaks. To put it in a scatter plot of what we measure versus what we would have modeled, again, very simple, you know, just bonehead sort of empirical model. You can see that a linear stationary view of the world simply cannot account for what happens when things get interesting in these systems. Okay, so to sum up this section of the talk, we see that the nonlinearity and non-stationarity of runoff response can be quantified with really simple parameters that we can estimate directly from data for hundreds of places around the world. This shows us not only that many places around the world are in fact nonlinear and non-stationary, but there's a range of behavior. We don't get really exotic end member cases, but at the same time, there's enough variability there to be interesting to try to understand. And of course, this is important then for understanding peak flows, particularly in an era where things like precipitation intensity will be changing. We're making the atmosphere wetter because we're making the atmosphere warmer, right? A wetter atmosphere can hold more moisture. It can deliver precipitation at higher intensity. So we need to understand what that shift to a higher intensity future is going to mean. Simultaneously, we are probably on average around the world making the landscape drier for the same reason that we're making the atmosphere wetter, right? And that might be then decreasing the sensitivity of the landscape to that precipitation. We kind of need to know which one of these is going to win out in the long term. Okay, and maybe analyses like the ones I've just outlined here are a step in that direction. I'm now going to ask our chairman how much time do we have? You mean I have 15 minutes? No, you mean the room has 15 minutes, right? Let me just do one more fun one here. We're going to go to China, okay? And we're going to go to the Lus Plateau of China, okay? This is a vast area of you know, hundreds of meters deep of glacial loess, okay? And it was the source of a lot of particulate air pollution to the cities of eastern China due to, you know, landscape degradation. So the Chinese did what the Chinese do and told everyone, go plant trees. And they did, massively so. And so here we see precipitation records before tree planting and after tree planting, and then the blue curves show stream flow in a bunch of different streams. And you can see the high flows went away, right? So that has been studied a lot, but it's been studied from the perspective of what happened to the average flow, not what happened to the peak flow. And so since we have a tool that allows us to see the sensitivity of stream flow to precipitation, we said, okay, what can we learn about the coupling between precipitation and stream flow in a landscape where someone has fundamentally transformed how green the surface is? So, so we have a series of study sites. The largest basin there is like 3 times the size of Switzerland, which is either big or small, depending on your perspective, I understand. It's many times the size of Connecticut, let's say it that way. The green curves here show for each of these basins the increase in the leaf area index, okay? And the dotted line down the middle is roughly when the government said, go plant trees. And what the increase in the leaf area index in some of these places show is that, by golly, you plant trees and you get a lot more green, right? In a couple of these other basins, they were already tree covered. And so things didn't change very much. What the blue curves show is the peak runoff you get per unit rainfall, per unit storm input by this deconvolution technique. And you can see roughly the same time that the leaf area index starts to climb, the response to precipitation starts to drop, okay? Now the question is, what's the mechanistic link? And we can think of at least 3 different hypotheses. One is you put trees on the landscape, you intercept precipitation in the tree canopy, and then that water evaporates. So that's the graph on the left. We would expect that under low intensity precipitation, we would have a big proportional effect. So on a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, we'd expect that effect to be big. But for high intensity events, we wouldn't expect a big proportional effect because you're just going to wash out whatever is in the canopy. Okay? Second possibility, we plant trees and we extract moisture from the soil. What does that do? It reduces the fraction of the landscape that's wet enough to generate runoff. And so we might expect that we'd get a similar sort of reduction in runoff response across a range of precipitation intensities. So on a logarithmic scale, we'd get 2 parallel lines. The third possibility is that by planting trees, the rooting of those trees probably increases infiltration rates. And we might expect that effect to be the biggest at relatively high rainfall rates that are high enough to actually make things wet, right? So we might expect that when we plot this, we'd get 2 curves that diverge more at high precipitation rates. So here's the data. Never mind the top graph. The top graph shows the same thing, but not on a logarithmic scale. Well, the top graph is interesting to show you how sort of dramatic this elimination of storm flow peaks is. But on a logarithmic scale, you see that in the places where things changed a lot, they actually changed more at high intensity precipitation than at low intensity precipitation. That says that the thing that we all thought was going on, which is you have more leaves and they just evaporate more water, is not the primary reason why peak flows have gone down in the streams draining the Loess Plateau. You know, it's another wonderful case of having a nice hypothesis that Mother Nature will just destroy right in front of your eyes, and you'll learn something from that process. Interestingly, if we plot the increase in leaf area index against the change in peak height, we see a dramatic decline and a nearly linear decline in terms of the change in percentage in leaf area index and the change in percent of the runoff response peak. We see that that is bigger than the change in the average runoff. Adding to the support for the hypothesis that we've actually increased infiltration, what has happened in the basins that have had the biggest change in leaf area index is that base flows have actually gone up by about 20%. So that is further support for this view that we've learned something interesting and surprising about how that landscape uses water and how planting trees all over it has changed the way that it uses water. Okay, with that, I have eaten up far too much of your noontime. I thank you very much for your kind attention. I thank again the organizers for inviting me here today, and I'd welcome any discussion that you would be interested in. Thank you.
Let's shoot for 1 or 2 questions.
With the isotopic lag that you're seeing in streams? Just a methods question on how are you controlling for dilution in your isotopic ratios when you sample out of the stream versus precipitation?
Well, so I don't know what you mean by dilution. I mean, the whole point of the analysis is that when you sample precipitation, you're sampling what fell today or this week or this month, right? And when you sample the stream, you're sampling a mixture of whatever the landscape is giving you. They're both essentially instantaneous samples. In fact, the precipitation samples are averaged over whatever time interval the sampler is open, right? The streamflow samples are more or less instantaneous. And so you actually have a little more variability in the stream because they are instantaneous samples. But the reason the response is so damped is because the stream itself is averaging together a bunch of different precipitation events that have been stored and mixed in the landscape.
Yeah.
We can talk more. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, thanks, Professor Kirchner. I'm curious about, you mentioned the fact that there's 80% of river network that's wet and dry, changing throughout the year, but not always always existing. I'm curious about from some folks in our group and in Jim's group is working on enhanced rock weathering.
Yeah.
This fact of some rivers being present and not present throughout the year, is there any implications that you can think about of could potentially the enhanced rock weathering derived additional carbon be sometimes lost just in the wet dry transition, dry wet?
So I'm not going to I'm not going to say anything about enhanced rock weathering because I don't know enough. However, I will say if you look across the aisle to your right, you'll see someone in a light green shirt who is working specifically on, among other things, network extension and retraction and the change in lengths of streams of different orders and so on, who is exactly trying to work out the implications, for example, for atmospheric exchange, right? And so she could speak much more competently to this subject than I can at the moment. But I'd be happy to discuss with both of you. Okay.
Okay. Okay, Pete, you can have one quick one. Oh, never mind. I'm saying no. Ask later. Okay, one last thank you, and then class dismissed.